Okay, so to be clear, we have the pro side and then the negative side, and then rebuttal for who after that?
The two people that just spoke.
Okay.
So each person gets 1 minute,
Okay.
and then on to the next round
Okay.
of pro and con.
Sounds good. Sweet.
And then at the end of all of both speeches and both rebuttals, then you each get 30 seconds to have a conclusion.
With our team.
Most of the conclusions are at the very end, all of them.
Right. So yeah, you have a 30-second conclusion to wrap it up to clearly articulate why it is that we should agree with your side.
Perfect. Sweet. Awesome. So, resolved. Rehabilitation ought to be valued over retribution in a criminal justice system. I am arguing for the affirmative or the pro side of this resolution. So imagine you're in prison for a small offense. Let's say for theft, for example. Let's switch it up and say you're now in prison for murder. You're a totally different person. This resolution can be boiled down just that easily. Should both of those subjects ought to re-enter society over staying in prison for committing a crime? So my 3 topics for discussion today are going to be a brief history of rehabilitation, the Stanford Prison Experiment, and how this problem can be solved. So firstly, let's talk about a brief history. According to the American Psychological Association, until the mid-1970s, rehabilitation was a key part of the U.S. prison policy. Now, prisoners were encouraged to develop occupational skills and resolve psychological problems such as substance abuse, aggression, that might interfere with their reintegration into society. This kept prisoners motivated to do their time and to get out. Although since the 70s, rehabilitation has taken a back seat and overlooked due to the get tough on crime approach that society strongly believes right now. People see punishment as prison's main function, rather than a place for improvement. James Gilligan, a clinical professor of psychiatry and law at NYU, states that 2/3 of prisoners reoffend within 3 years of leaving prison, often with a more serious and violent crime. Serving punishment by rotting in a cell will cause no change in behavior of that prisoner. This is often overlooked by those advocating for the negation of this resolution. In fact, my next point, has anybody ever heard of the Stanford Prison Experiment? Nice, sweet. So for those of you who are unaware of it, this experiment was conducted by boarding up each end of a hallway in the Stanford Psychology Department building. To create a prison cells, the facilitator, Philip Zimbardo, actually made doors to create bars on them and cell numbers to create a reality prison experience. This is according to the main prison experiment website, prisonexp.org. In the Lucifer Effect, written by the same man who conducted that experiment, Philip Zimbardo, he describes this experiment by stating, in that study, normal college students were randomly assigned to play the role of guard or inmate for 2 weeks in a simulated prison experiment. Yet the guards quickly became so brutal that the experiment had to be shut down after only 6 days. The experiment was supposed to be for 2 weeks long. The results were very thorough due to one prisoner being released after only 36 hours due to uncontrollable bursts of screaming, anger, and crying. This is the college student. There were also escape attempts made by the prisoners themselves in as little as 3 days, largely due to the guards taking their roles too far when it comes to their behavior in the prison. So why is this experiment part of my argument? Well, this is due to the results that came out of the experiment. The guards taunted inmates with insults, petty orders, and given them boring tasks to accomplish. They dehumanized these college students. Sean McLeod, a former psychology professor, wrote in an article in 2017 published by Simple Psychology, naming this behavior of the guards as de-individualization. This concept is very complex, and it deals with the guards being so immersed in the norms of their group that they lose a sense of identity and personal responsibility. When given power and minimal responsibilities, guards can lash out on prisoners. This psychologically harms prisoners, making it much harder for them to re-enter society in a more positive way. Switching to my last point, how this problem can be solved. According to an article published by The Conversation, an independent source of news and views from an academic and research community, rehabilitation today is almost always associated with cognitive behavioral theory. This targets a relatively narrow range of crime-producing needs, including pro-criminal attitudes, such as those thoughts, values, and sentiments that support criminal conduct. Programmees also dedicate a lot of time to change personality traits, such as self-control, low self-control, hostility, or lack of empathy. Granted, not everybody can be successfully treated in prison, although substantial evidence exists suggesting this type of approach actually reduces the amount of reoffenders released back into society. The Justice Policy Institute breaks down this topic in an article entitled Treatment or Incarceration. A key element of making this strategy is obtaining the active support of the business community and those concerned outside the criminal justice system. It is necessary that society as a whole look beyond the government in this regard and stray away from the tough-on-crime mentality. In regard to retribution, this concept looks backward toward the initial crime itself, justifying punishment as what criminal deserves for the initial act committed. In criminal justice tradition, justifications given for punishment have been tied to an understanding of ultimate reality that believes the moral universe requires retributive justice. And that's a big concept right there. So this is dealing with natural laws and divine laws and theology that are violated. Such retributive justice restores the moral balance, according to a senior professor of peace theology, Ted Grimsrud. In conclusion, advocating for the affirmative of this resolution, I believe society can spark change in this problem. By implementing more policies, making it easier for prisoners to re-enter society with a positive impact will show the world these prisoners simply just made a mistake. Rehabilitation allows people to correct their mistake, serve their time, and go back into society with a new approach to success, making it easier to stay out of trouble with the law. Thank you.
I am arguing for the opposite side, retribution. German philosopher once said, Immanuel Kant, justice would cease to be justice if it were bartered away for any consideration whatever. Rehabilitation and retribution is a tricky subject just based on its definitions alone, but my argument doesn't stem from the ethics or emotional side of things, but from justice and its very definition. Justice means just behavior or treatment, fairness, neutrality, morality. Rehabilitation works, but it is not fair. Even the guy in charge of subjecting criminals to the government's greatest sanctions is called justice, which brings me to my first argument. Jolie McCullough from the Texas Tribune says, anytime a person is subject to government's greatest sanction, it merits thoughtful review. California's Prop 47, which reduced nonviolent felonies to misdemeanors from $400 to $950, which was the penalty from these felonies, made roughly 10,000 inmates eligible for resentencing. This presents a serious problem. If resentencing is really thorough, it's going to slow down the court systems. But if it's hurried or partial, then justice will not be served. According to another article by Harriet Fox, a man stole a firearm under the new proposition and was only given a misdemeanor. The gun was under $950, so he was able to just get a misdemeanor. In my opinion, this is completely unsafe and not adequate punishment. So what is adequate punishment? Immanuel Kant has another thing to say about that. He says, the equalization of punishment with crime is therefore only possible by the cognition of the judge extending even to the penalty of death. If the supremacy clause in the Constitution is not enough to convince you, maybe Wiley's online library can. They mention that expiation, or making amends for wrongdoing, is a fundamental purpose of punishment. In other words, an eye for an eye is going to restrain violence. If repeated instances of rehabilitation only undermines the natural philosophy of law and precedent. For example, the gun guy in Palm Springs got a misdemeanor instead of a felony because the buffer increased from $400 to $950. What type of rehabilitation will help this man rejoin society if he's just gonna go back to stealing guns later for a simple misdemeanor? Well, according to Etienne Benson, one of the biggest drivers of the rehabilitation movement is budget shortfalls as opposed to criminal corrections. Now, in order for society to obtain justice, we need to seriously reappraise our priorities, shifting them from the economics of the prison system to the prison system. We need to seriously reappraise our priorities from the economics of the prison system to morality in society. This will require punishment sanctions. California's Prop 47 does the opposite. As a matter of fact, the DNA database has shrunken significantly since the implementation of this proposition, according to the National Review. DNA sampling does not occur for misdemeanors anymore. This gives little incentive for law enforcement to chase down someone who stole the gun. Yes, the point of prison is to help people rejoin society, and yes, rehabilitation is successful in some cases, but these are not the most important priorities. First, we must keep our communities safe by stripping basic rights away from people who have cheated society. There's not supposed to be grace and punishment, only justice.
So I have a minute to have
Yes.
you go? Okay.
And I will cut you off in a minute.
Okay. In one of my sources I cite the New York Times article entitled "Prison Can Be a Productive Punishment, Rehabilitation Works." James Gilligan describes the effects of punishment and restraint in prison systems, discussing how it can be more effective and less expensive. Gilligan offers a plan for secure, home-like residential communities, or anti-prisons, in replacement of every prison in this country. Clay said that an eye for an eye will maintain violence, but if we restructure our prison systems and our correctional facilities, this can actually rehabilitate prisoners more than they think. One of the facts I have from the American Psychological Association states that the U.S. has more than 2 million people in prisons and jails, the equivalent to 1 in every 142 U.S. residents. So with overpopulation being a major problem, our correctional facilities do need to be revamped and changed in order to allow for prisoners to...
So Tony's argument is basically only about how rehabilitation is better than retribution. And yes, I do believe that in some cases, but in relation to the prison systems, I disagree greatly. The question here is, does punishment facilitate rehabilitation in itself? He said 2/3 of people do not, they can't rejoin society and they reoffend. Well, in my opinion, if that many people reoffend, then we may as well punish them in the first place. In other words, I don't think it's about the government saving money by reducing prison overcrowding. I believe it's about remaining consistent with precedent and written law.